I expect you've heard the old saying, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. That's true when you're meeting somebody for the first time, and it's true when you're interviewing for a job, but it's also true when you're teaching. The first day of a class, or a workshop, or a team meeting, or a seminar matters very much because it gives the students a very, very strong sense of what the whole experience is going to be like. It's depressingly common to find teachers and professors who spend the first day just dragging their way through the syllabus, saying what they're going to do in the course, rather than actually getting on with doing any of it. And of course that has the sad effect of draining away energy from the class instead of supercharging it with energy right from the beginning. Approach like that makes the first day of class dull and can easily communicate the wrong feeling about the course as a whole. By contrast, a lively and animated introduction to the topic straight away gives the students a welcome feeling of purposefulness and interest, and it energizes them for the work to come. So keep that in mind. There's no more important moment in your work as a teacher than the first day of class or the first day of term. I think teaching succeeds best when teachers and students have a relationship with each other of some kind. And relationships begin with knowing each other's names.
There's a lot of prep work you do to make that first day and make the semester work well. And that's not just the usual sort of preparing the content. For me, it's learning their names. Why are the characters such a highly valuable resource that leads to such powerful competitive advantage? Megan?
Yeah.
I get a photo roster online that we have for all of our students, and I will look it over, and I won't be able to learn all their names and faces for the first day, but I'll try to learn at least a handful.
I do try to learn everybody's name. I can make it up to about 90 or 100.
And that way, as they come into class, I will, I'll say, "Good morning, Patrick, nice to see you," and the students quickly recognize, wow, he's taken the time to learn our names. And I will have tent cards with their names that I hand out so that I can learn the rest of their names.
The interesting trick there is that the students know I can't know everybody's name in class, but I'll call on a student in the back of a classroom with 150 people by name, and they'll be a bit shocked.
Now, knowing the students' names gives them a sense of belonging. It also lets them know that you're going to be paying close attention to each of them. Research shows that students tend to work harder and respond more positively if they believe that the instructor views them as individuals rather than simply just as faces in the crowd. Now, my own way of doing this is similar to that of Dr. Roberto. I also, as students are coming into the room on the very first day, I hand them a tent card and they have to write out their first and last name in bold letters with a Sharpie pen, and then I make them hold it in front of them and I take a photograph of them with my digital camera. Now, it makes them laugh because it feels like being a prisoner and doing a mug shot, but nevertheless, it puts them on notice right from the beginning that I'm taking them seriously as individuals and that I want to know them by name. One of the incidental side effects of doing something like this is that rather than having an awkward silence as they come filtering into the room one by one, is that it's an activity and they laugh at one another and they grin bashfully as they stand up in front of my camera to get the pictures taken. That's much better than the awkward silence, isn't it? Then I go back to my room at the end of the first class meeting, print out quick copies of these photographs on my printer, cut them out and stick them all on my office wall. So then, within a few hours of meeting the class, I've got pictures of them all in front of me, and I start memorizing the names one by one in the way that you heard Dr. Nowicki and Dr. Roberto doing. That means that when we get to the second class meeting, I also can talk to a lot of them. I can identify them by name. I also do this. At the beginning of class meetings, I often say to one student, go around the class and name everybody else. And if the student quickly gets stuck and can't name the others, then I say, all right, bring out the tent cards again, because I want them to get to know each other's names. That makes it much more likely that when we get into class discussion, they'll be talking to each other by name rather than simply saying, as he said, oh yes, as she said. All right, now when I talked to Professors Michael Roberto and Scott Page, I found that they had a very similar kind of first day routine to my own. But in some respects, they've ratcheted it up to an even higher level, so that the students know these are going to be intense and committed classes.
There's some signaling I want to do the first day. On the first day, my colleagues laugh at me. I typically bring not a single piece of paper to class, no notes. And the idea is I've sort of totally memorized what I want to do that day. And again, it's a little bit of sort of theater, but it really signals to the students he's incredibly well prepared. I need to be incredibly well prepared. He's committed to really understanding the material and being engaged with us.
I almost always give an assignment, on the first day.
As a way of scaring off the timid or half-hearted
Yeah,
ones.
but not so much scaring people up, but just recognizing that they're going to have to bring it. In a social science class, especially in a modeling class like this, we don't just want to tell anecdotes about the crowd being wise, we want to unpack why it's true.
I send out a case study by email, along with a set of questions and an assignment for a 1 to 2 page memo that's due the very first day of class. That really engages them in the material right at the beginning. So over the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about basically this map of these different kinds of corporate strategies.
I really like to both have fun with the material and let the students know that I think this stuff is really interesting. I think if you don't create an environment in which people think the professor's really excited about this material or the lecturer's excited about this material, it's hard for them to get excited.
No, I fully endorse what both of them said. It's a great idea to use the first class to explain your subject straight away and to show the students why it matters. Among other things, you should use the time to show them that it's fascinating, that this isn't something they've simply got to slog through, it's something they should want to learn. In most subjects, there's usually a fund of curious anecdotes about the subject, and it's a good idea to use a couple of the good stories that that subject has generated as a way of stimulating student interest. I teach a course on American environmental history, and often on the first day I'll talk a little bit about some of the most colourful characters in American environmental history. Henry David Thoreau is a great example. The fact that when he went off to live in his little wooden shack in Walden, students often imagine that he was infinitely remote out in some wilderness area, very far away from civilization. Whereas in fact, of course, he was just around the corner from Emerson and from most of his friends, and could pop over and see them in the evening or go to have a good dinner with one of them if he wanted to. I talk also about John Muir, who, after the Civil War, made an astonishing walk from Indianapolis all the way to the Florida coast and wrote a wonderful book about it called My 1,000-Mile Walk to the Gulf. That draws them in and gets them interested in their great personalities and some of the eccentric fascinations of the course. And again, this is a common technique. John Hale, our professor of archaeology from the University of Louisville, he describes the teacher he remembers most fondly from his own undergraduate days at Yale. This is a professor called Donald Kagan.
My exemplar of a great teacher is my mentor from my undergraduate days. I was at Yale. He came as a young faculty member the same semester I came as a freshman. So we started together. His name is Donald Kagan. He's a Greek historian. My very first class was his class in Greek history. I had no thoughts of what college would be like. And here was this very tough commanding figure in the front of the room who ordered the front row up with their notebooks and their pens, and we all thought, are they going to have to take dictation? He made the front row of students into a hoplite phalanx of Greek warriors with the notebooks for shields and the pens for spears, and demonstrated maneuvers on the field of the hoplite phalanx before he ever got into mechanics of the course or broad overviews. We were hooked from the first minutes in that class for the entire course.
Now, one of the things you need to do on the very first day of class is to show the students that you love your subject, especially if it's something which doesn't have a particularly good reputation, like statistics. Give them an inkling that it's at least possible for the subject itself to be lovable. Even students who like to think of themselves as very cool and to act jaded, they find it actually very difficult to resist your enthusiasm. And they'll be drawn in, sometimes even despite themselves. And again, we've got plenty of research to confirm this point, showing that in general students learn more and work harder in classes that spark their intellectual curiosity. It's an obvious truism, and it's borne out by the experiences we've all had. So right from the start, you need to show the students it's a privilege and a pleasure to be here, and we're going to do something which is fascinating right from the beginning. It's also a good idea on the first day to show the students why it matters, why the stuff they're learning is significant to them. Now, in the case of professional education in a business school or a medical school or a law school, that's easy enough because the work speaks directly to some kind of aspect of their professional development, or very often it's getting them ready to be able to pass the qualifying exams. In liberal arts education, the kind of teaching I mainly do as a historian, there's not quite such a direct payoff. But even so, I've tried very hard in my opening remarks to show how the kinds of things they'll be learning with me are related to the other disciplines. I say, for example, that even when we're studying the history of a fairly remote time and place, what we're looking at is the way in which the world they live in developed, the phases through which it went, to end up with the situation we've got now. That there's no simple linear connection, but by understanding these areas of the human condition and the human experience, they'll get a richer and fuller sense of the world in which they're living. And of course, this relates to things I've said in earlier lectures. It matters also because the complex issues in any subject will help the students to start thinking for themselves. It'll help them think both about this kind of subject and also about other matters, enable them to begin developing critical skills which are so necessary for the creation of lifelong learners. Let me show you a little clip of myself speaking to a senior seminar at Emory. This is on the first day of a seminar called The Environmentalists and Their Critics, which I taught in the fall semester of 2009. Now, when I'm teaching environmental issues, I've found from long experience that there's one of the special problems I need to deal with is the students' tendency to assume that environmental matters are a simple struggle between good and evil. And I'm determined not to let them think that. So what we're actually going to be doing in this course is taking into account these ambiguities, and we're going to study the debates. Very often, you'll read people who disagree very sharply. But don't worry about that. I mean, we're fully aware of the fact that there are disagreements in many of these areas on things like environmental health issues and on global warming and the causes of it. The great thing about being a historian is that you don't have to have an opinion. And it's arguable, as Anna was saying earlier, that it's actually a good idea for you not to have an opinion. What you've got to do is to come to terms with the complexity. It's not so emotionally satisfying, but it's probably more necessary. You've got to understand that these are very, very complex questions. I believe also that a good teacher should challenge the students right from day one. Don't let them have a day for getting used to it. Get right into it. It's important, for example, to emphasize the difficulties of the subject you're teaching. You've got to communicate, if you can, that the subject is difficult, but that it's worth the struggle. Don't ever say to a group of students or learners in any situation, this isn't too hard. That's a very unwise thing to say because, as you can imagine, they'll be discouraged if they do find it hard. It'll make them feel stupid. But on the other hand, if they agree with you that it isn't hard, it'll make them complacent. So to make a remark like that, you lose at both ends. Let's listen for a moment now to Scott Page. He's a professor of complexity theory. The very name of the subject he teaches sounds difficult. And here he is explaining how he uses some of the time on the first day of classes.
What I try and do in the first day is sort of broadly introduce the topic, but then I'll do a very simple sort of mathematical thing, and then I'll do something sort of very very hard. That's probably as complicated as we'll do, and I'll sort of say, these are the endpoints. This is sort of where we're going to be playing, and these are the sort of level of mathematical skills you're going to need to hang in this course. You don't want to have somebody like go through the first half of the course fine and then think, oh my gosh, I never took differential equations or I never took calculus, and so now I can't do the second half of the course.
Now you probably noticed that there he shows the students what's going to be expected, not just by saying it, but then by actually doing problems of the simplest and the most complex kind, as a way of making sure that the students there can realistically be expected to manage it. Now, because he's teaching a course which has got some mathematical component, he's got to deal with the special problem of math anxiety, a point I'll refer to periodically during the course. Many of the students feel math anxiety, and he's trying to manage it straight away. Now, another thing to do on the first meeting of your class is demonstrate your own expertise in some aspect of the subject material. It's true that the students assume that you know all about it because you're the teacher, but nevertheless, if you can make a little impression on them with your own mastery of the subject, it's quite a good idea to do so. It may seem egotistical, but it's a good way of establishing your intellectual authority in addition to your teaching authority. The two usually go together very nicely. If you can, it's appropriate to describe some of your own research in an area like this or a related area. Now, another class I taught in the fall of 2009, from which you'll see some excerpts, was a freshman seminar on American conservative history. And earlier that year, I'd published a book on the history of American conservatism, which I assigned to the class. There are good and bad aspects to assigning your own book, which I'll talk about later on. But it did give me the opportunity with that group to say, as I was writing the book, here are some of the special conceptual difficulties I encountered, and now I'm going to introduce you to those difficulties as well. And the students take an interest because they tend to be impressed by the fact that you've written a book on that particular topic. It's also appropriate on the first day to summarise the state of the field of inquiry so that the students have a sense of participating in a larger endeavour. As I mentioned last time, it isn't as though the disciplines sit still. The disciplines themselves are developing all the time. Some of the sciences incredibly quickly. And it's great to be able to say to the students, this is where the discipline's got to. And these are the ways in which we're going to encounter some of the current problems in that realm of study. I mentioned in an earlier lecture the way in which the women's movement gave rise to women's history. In the same way, in one of my courses in the fall of 2009, I was able to tell the students how the development of the environmental movement in the 1960s and 70s gave rise to this new field of study, environmental history, where really for the first time historians began to study systematically things like the human impact on the environment in terms of pollution and problems of relative overpopulation, but then also to get into broader questions like what happened when the first horses went to America after Columbus? What's the relationship between people and plants and animals and the wind and the crops and the plants and so on? That's now become itself a fully developed field of academic study. So here I am on the first day of my environmental history course explaining some of those points. The development of a new interest in society has caused a new historical interest to develop. In other words, once the environmental movement began in the 1960s, it had the effect of causing certain historians to say, oh yes, now that Rachel Carson is criticising atmospheric contamination and pollution, and now that Paul Ehrlich is raising the possibility that the world is drastically overpopulated, we ought to start looking back at the way in which things like pollution and contamination and population growth were thought about in earlier times. And obviously, as the environmental movement matured and developed after the 1960s, the field of environmental history matured in parallel with it. Now that leads me straight on to the question of whether environmental history should include a component of advocacy. And it gets the students thinking about it and trying to articulate their views. And again, I want to emphasise this is all happening on the first day. So straight away, as they encounter the course, they're getting into these kinds of debates. Now, it's always been caught slightly between two different poles. One is the idea that your job as a historian is simply to study things and understand them. The other is to say, we've got to study them and understand them in order that we can become more effective advocates for the environment. Do you see that difference? Adam, Graham, let me ask you. Is it appropriate for fields of historical study to be advocacy as well?
I don't see why not. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you why not, and then you answer, okay? Because if you use them for advocacy, you've got an overwhelming temptation to emphasize certain points of historical knowledge and suppress others. You're going to tend to emphasize those things which support your cause and suppress those things which embarrass your cause.
You can approach things, though, in a non-neutral fashion, but also a non-biased fashion. If you're trying to prove a point and you're using historical data, say, on the number of trees that have been cut down in order to support your idea about forestry regulation, you certainly can do that, and you're certainly trying to prove a point, so you're advocating, but you shouldn't be doing it from a biased standpoint.
Now you'll notice there that from the very beginning, I'm willing to push the students for their response, for their engagement, and for their contribution. That one student at first, he gave a brief answer and didn't really want to say anymore, but I insisted. And by pushing him a little bit and by explaining how to think of it, he was able to come up with a slightly more coherent answer. So I'm trying to establish high expectations. I'm inviting them to join in. I'm involving them in thinking about the subject right from the beginning. Of course, it's hard work for them, and it's hard work for me as the teacher, but it pays great dividends in the long run because it adapts the students to the mood that the class is going to have throughout. And again, my experience has always been that the students are highly adaptable. If you set a mood, they will live up to it. And once again, there's an overwhelming body of research findings confirming that involvement rather than passivity leads to better learning. And therefore, what we've got to do is to get the students involved right from the start. Now, another thing that's necessary to do on the first day of the course is to establish your expectations for the course straight away. You need to make it clear right from the start that, as Scott Page said in that role in a moment ago, they've got to bring it. In other words, they've got to become involved. They've got to do work of an adequate standard. And that you, as the teacher, are committing yourself to helping them do so. On the first day also, describe the kind of environment in the classroom that you favour. And don't put up with things that you don't like or that annoy you. Otherwise, you'll be wasting precious time dealing with distractions. The longer I teach, the more intolerant I become. And so here I am again on day one, setting up my expectations and laying down the law to the students, and also, to some extent, trying to justify them. Just a few details about the class itself. If you've read through these requirements, they sound terribly stern and unyielding, especially things like what you can't do. No eating, drinking, chewing or wearing hats in class. The reason for this, can you take your hat off? Thanks so much. The reason for this is that over the years, when I was a beginning teacher, I used to be annoyed by all sorts of things which happened in class. And then if I was a member of a class, if you had this experience, you're sitting in class and someone right next to you starts eating the big breakfast or the Egg McMuffin. Bottles of water's fine. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah, and I mean, another thing which used to happen is that, everyone would come in and pop the cans of Coke, and then someone would spill one, and there'd be a great sugary stain on the floor, and then a line of ants would come in, all this kind of thing. I'm interested in the natural world, but not in quite that way. I explain why, so as not to seem arbitrary, and to try to be humorous about it. But I do want you to keep this point in mind. Classes aren't places where we should practice the idea of human equality. A class is a hierarchy, and you as the teacher are at the head of that class. It's appropriate for you to create the rules and to enforce a class discipline. Very often on the first day, I also introduce the concept of special time, the idea that this class is set apart from the rest of their everyday lives. Sometimes, for example, if a student is chewing gum, I say to her, it's usually a girl, do you chew gum in everyday life? And is that an ordinary activity? And she'll say, yes. And I say, well, this isn't ordinary life. This isn't ordinary time. This is special time. What we're going to do here is we're going to devote all our time and attention just to the study of history. It's very difficult and it needs all our attention. And after that, sometimes if I see somebody eating or wearing a hat, I just have to say to them, special time. And straight away they know, oh yes, I can't do that in here. And again, as I said before, they're adaptable. They don't mind as long as the rules are consistent and as long as, if necessary, you can elaborate why you've got explain why you've got the rules you have. Now, on the first day, you need to tell the students what kind of work they're going to be required to do, both in the class itself and out of class, what kind of reading and writing assignments they'll have to do. Incidentally, when I say student here, it's because I'm familiar with teaching students in college, but I do think it's equally applicable if you're teaching if you're working with a group, a project team or a set of employees or any kind of audience. The same kinds of principles apply in every case. As I said, my experience is the classroom, so that's the idiom with which I'm familiar with, in which I speak, but the teaching situations are essentially the same everywhere. Now, the things the students are going to have to do should be included on a syllabus or a list of goals and assignments, and you should paraphrase them briefly. But as I emphasised at the first, don't spend a long part of the first day telling the students what they're going to do. It's just terribly boring. Another thing I always do is that one part of my classes is always devoted to the discussion of assigned readings. And I say to the students, right on the first day, I'm going to call on you directly by name to participate. I'm not going to give you the opportunity of participating. I'm going to require it of you. Some of them don't like it, but again, once they know that they're going to have to do it, it's that much more likely that they will in fact learn how to do it. And it puts them on notice that they can't be passengers. I'm just not going to let them be carried along by the flow of the class. They've got to join in whether they like it or not. Now, this also has another very, very benign effect. One thing the students hate above all else is to be embarrassed. And so I often say, if you don't do the reading and then I call on you, you will be embarrassed. And the fear of that kind of embarrassment is very, very intense indeed. Occasionally I actually call a student on it. And when they haven't done the reading, I say, I required you to do the reading. I didn't invite you to do it, I required it. It will be embarrassing to you if you don't do it. So then at that point, of course, the student feels awful because they know that I'm justified in saying it. And the students around them, who also hadn't done the work, think, thank God that wasn't me. That could so easily have been me. Now I'm going to do the reading as well. And from that moment onwards, everyone really does do the work. It actually elevates the entire intellectual level of the entire course from then on for the rest of the semester. Just that simple rebuke, which only ever has to be done once. I also would tell the students, now when you're doing these readings, you've got to use the dictionary because you're going to be encountering a language, some of which is highly specialized and which you won't otherwise know. Students seem to have a profound reluctance to use the dictionary. What they hope is that they'll simply be able to pick it up as they're going along from the context. And although that's sometimes true, equally it's sometimes not true, and that therefore they've got to start learning a new vocabulary. And by actually specifying these things on the first day, I make it a bit more likely that they really will do what they're supposed to be doing. I also think it's very important to get right into the content of the course on the first day. If it's a lecture course, give an introductory lecture to the course as a whole. If it's a seminar, devise an activity that gives the students a premonition of the kind of work they'll be doing from week to week. And if possible, you should make this activity the kind of thing which enables them to get a sense of the range of activities they're going to have to do, and also which will give you an idea of the range of ability levels you've got in the students around you. One thing I often do is ask a student to read a short passage in front of the whole group, because as I listen to the student reading, I get a good sense of how well they've understood it. And then I'll follow up by asking the reader of that passage, or sometimes one of the others, to paraphrase the passage. Because again, it's my experience that if you ask a student to paraphrase, their ability to do it fairly or really well or really poorly is a very good index of how competent they're going to be as students overall. And of course, the accurate analysis of texts and accurate assimilation of the information they embody is a vital part of the study of history and most other disciplines as well. So straight away from asking for the reading and the paraphrasing, I can get a good sense of who's going to be able to do it effectively. And these are issues I'm going to go into more detail about when we get to lecture 11 of this course, which is a lecture devoted to the leading of seminars. So, in all these ways, make the first day of the semester challenging and make it interesting to the students. Make it intellectually stimulating and make it representative of how the course itself will develop throughout the coming weeks. Just to sum up now what I've mentioned today, the first meeting is critical, and therefore you should plan for it very carefully. You should aim to be establishing a one-on-one relationship with every student in the class, or at least with as many of them as possible, depending obviously on the size of the class. And learning your students' names is the very best way to do it. There's nothing they appreciate more than you knowing who they are, and it makes it much more likely that they'll work hard and conscientiously and attentively. Show your enthusiasm for the subject straight away. Show why the subject is important straight away. And give the students a sense of the difficulty and challenge of the material. Demonstrate your own expertise. Show them that you're good at it and that they're right to be taking the class from you. And set rules for the learning environment to make it quite clear that you won't tolerate annoyances. At the moment, incidentally, I've banned the use of laptop computers in class because now that we've gone wireless, the students are constantly surfing the web or texting in class, so I've prohibited them from doing it, and I feel entirely justified in doing so. But if there's one lesson to take from thinking about the first day of class, it's this: engage the students in the subject immediately.